what we should actually be talking about are the 5 lessons that we are learning as each day unfolds. The 5 lessons are as follows. The leftist politicians, leftist pundits are supportive of Ukraine's right to self-determination. They are changing their Twitter profile pictures to the Ukrainian flag. They are lionizing Zelensky. They are doubling down on the idea that Ukrainians have a right to defend their own nation. So there's a word for that. It's called nationalism. And the left is very supportive of nationalism when it comes to Ukraine. And the lesson we should learn from this is that Democrats are full of BS because they support nationalism when it comes to Ukraine, but nationalism in the United States, they tell us, is racist. They tell us it's borderline. It's based on white supremacy, that nationalism is xenophobic and evil, and we should reject it. So America first, they tell us, is racist, that we shouldn't consider our national interest over the interest of the rest of the world, that makes us bad people, yet in Ukraine, they are defending nationalism. That's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2 is the left is supportive of Ukraine defending their borders. They say, well, that Ukrainian border is Ukraine's to defend, and that's okay. They're allowed to defend themselves if the Russians compromise the Ukrainian border. Contrast that, of course, with the United States border. The United States border, especially our southern border, is completely porous, completely vulnerable, completely compromised, and the left's policies have actually contributed to that. The left's policies have created a border crisis here in the United States. So lesson number 2 is the left supports a border when it's a Ukrainian border, but they don't support a border when it's an American border. Now, these lessons are really interesting because they expose the ideology of the left. The ideology of the left is the destruction of our current economic, social, and governmental institutions here in the United States. The third lesson is very telling. So you see all of these pictures and these videos on social media right now of citizens taking up arms in the Ukraine. Even the Ukrainian government actually is offering weapons to citizens to defend their nation against the Russians. And the left is all about this. You know, they're all about putting on a pedestal citizens who are fighting a war even though they're not trained soldiers. And yet here in the United States, the left is against the Second Amendment. They say the Second Amendment is dangerous, is racist, that the founders only meant muskets. They didn't mean semi-automatic weapons. That the Second Amendment is, if you support the Second Amendment, they say essentially you support homicide. Well, the reason we have the Second Amendment here in the United States is because of situations like what's happening in Ukraine, where a superior or a nation with superior military force like Russia tries to violate the inherent rights of the Ukrainian people, and the Ukrainian people take up arms against that tyranny. That is why we have a Second Amendment here in the United States. In the event, to protect ourselves against the event where our government would try to take up arms against us, where we face that tyranny. Now, of course, the left here in the United States also says, well, it's stupid for citizens to think that they could defend themselves against the United States, the firepower of the United States government, meaning the military, meaning F-15s and tanks and nuclear weapons. What could a good old citizen from Kentucky and his shotgun do to defend against the firepower of the U.S. military? And Ukraine is a perfect example of this because Russia has superior firepower. Their military is stronger than individual citizens with their weapons. And yet, look at what citizens in Ukraine are doing, have been able to do. They've been able to hold Russia back thus far in a way that has surprised even Russia. So even if ultimately citizens with firearms can't entirely outgun tyrannical governments, they certainly can inflict damage. The left supports that in Ukraine and actively works to undermine that here in the United States. That's the third lesson. The fourth lesson is propaganda. You basically shouldn't believe anything that you see on social media about Ukraine or Russia right now. This is maybe the first war that's being fought on social media. Almost all of the stories have turned out to be fake news, whether that is the ghost of Kyiv, which was this story about a fighter pilot in Ukraine that had taken out five Russian fighter jets. Turns out that's just propaganda, that's fake. Likewise, the story of Snake Island, we were told that 13 Ukrainian soldiers looked at a Russian warship who had told them to surrender and said, answered the Russian warship by saying, F you, Russian warship. And in response, the Russian warship had obliterated the 13 soldiers who legend had it, were willing to give their lives for their nation. That turned out to be fake news too. A lot of what we're seeing is propaganda. It's propaganda from the Russian side, the Ukrainian side. It's called the fog of war officially. And it takes a beat. It takes a minute to fact check these stories when we see them, to fact check reports of what Russian soldiers are feeling, what Ukrainian soldiers are doing, how Russia has advanced or how Ukraine has held them from advancing. We don't know immediately whether these reports are true because propaganda is a fundamental part of waging war. Now, the point of all of this is lesson number 4 is that the left suddenly claims they care about propaganda. They suddenly claim they care about what is actually true and what is not true. And this is a different application than they have applied to the United States in the past 5 years, when the mainstream media themselves have been the purveyor of propaganda on behalf of the Democrats. So that's lesson number 4. Then the first 4 lessons, the takeaway from these lessons is that the ideology of the radical left isn't an ideology of pragmatism. It isn't a practical ideology. They don't want to restrict AR-15s here in our country because of the practical application of this, because they actually believe that this would save lives. They're doing it because they want to undermine the institutions, the social, cultural, and government institutions that make our nation what it is. And these are the ways that they do it. They tell us that patriotism is evil. They don't want us to have any pride in our country. They want us to be embarrassed of our country. They want to delegitimize the United States. They don't want us to have any national sovereignty. They don't want us to defend our borders, because how can you be a nation if you don't have a border? You can't. You cannot be a nation if you don't have a border. They don't want an armed citizenry. They want to disarm us because they know that an armed citizenry, when pushed to a certain point, will push back on tyrannical regimes who are trying to, overtake them. They don't want an armed citizenry. And propaganda they only care about when it suits them, when it gets them ratings. Otherwise, they are the purveyors of propaganda. So the 4 first lessons that we can take from Ukraine is that the radical left here in our country, it's very obvious what their ultimate goal is. Their ultimate goal is to undermine the United States of America. Now, the fifth lesson is weak leadership. The ramifications, the ripple effect of a weak U.S. president. Biden being a weak U.S. president who I mentioned before actively lobbied Democratic senators to filibuster sanctions on Nord Stream 2, which would have stopped Putin. Contrast that with the Trump presidency for a minute. Now, Trump actually increased NATO spending, right? He threatened to abolish NATO or, withdraw the United States from NATO as a way of forcing NATO members to actually pay their fair share, because the United States, prior to that, was paying the lion's share here. Trump increased NATO spending. He actually gave weapons to Ukraine that Obama and Biden had stopped giving, had refused to give deadly weapons to Ukraine to defend themselves. Trump actually said directly to Putin, if you move against Ukraine while I'm president, I will hit Moscow. Putin knew that he meant it. Trump warned Germany what would happen when Germany paid Russia billions of dollars for oil, and Trump warned them about doing that and then asking the U.S. to defend Germany from Russia. There's a reason that Russia and Putin are invading Ukraine while Biden is president, because weak leadership allows this. It creates a vacuum where evil can take action, a vacuum where tyrants and imperialists, socialist dictators like Putin will take advantage of. They will exploit this to spread their evil around the world. That did not happen under President Trump. So the fifth takeaway from what's happening in Ukraine is what happens, the ripple effect. How many people will die because of a weak U.S. leader here?